Joined military, married high school sweetheart, faced grueling shifts, she cheated with a captain. I came home to a pregnant wife. When I initially entered the military, I was remarkably naive. I genuinely accepted the recruiter's claims regarding numerous matters without understanding the distinction between doctrine, the ideal state of affairs, and reality, the actual situation. I assumed that officers were the most intelligent and capable individuals from prestigious colleges, detached, yet entirely devoted to the mission. I also had the impression that non-commissioned officers were the most skilled and proficient soldiers, promoted simply for being their best selves. Lastly, I was under the impression that soldiers would find family among comrades who enlisted to uphold and defend the United States Constitution against all threats, both foreign and domestic. I learned during my first year that, with few exceptions, these stereotypes were largely untrue. I had married my high school sweetheart, who was a couple of years younger than I, and I was eager to establish my worth as both a soldier and a man. I was willing to volunteer for overseas assignments, including war zones and the most challenging roles. Coming from a disadvantaged background, the military presented an ideal path out of the impoverished environment and into a middle-class life. The sales pitch was straightforward. If I dedicated myself to defending the United States, the Army would ensure my well-being and that of my family. Unfortunately, this did not unfold as promised for my 19-year-old wife and me. For privacy, all names have been changed. My initial military training included boot camp, airborne qualification, and ranger training. I accomplished many milestones and was deemed an official tough soldier by the U.S. Army. However, instead of being assigned to the Special Operations Forces or the 82nd Airborne Division, I was deployed overseas and placed in a security detail that had little to do with elite warfare, merely a matter of circumstance. Without delving into the specifics, this security role required me to work 24 hours on and then 24 hours off, followed by an 8-hour shift schedule for 3 consecutive days. However, due to budget cuts and multiple overseas conflicts, the U.S. Army decreased our personnel from 5 shifts down to just 2. Consequently, rather than the anticipated work schedule, my colleagues and I ended up working 24 hours on duty, followed by 6 hours of administrative work and 18 hours off continuously, year-round. Instead of 2,000 hours annually, we were clocking nearly 5,000 hours of work. This workload was unsustainable, undermining my ability to maintain both my job and my wife during my first military assignment. She held a high school diploma, but lacked any further education or specialized training. Therefore, while I was on duty, she spent considerable time at the on-base recreation center with numerous other young soldiers. Erin, 19, was a stunning blonde with striking blue eyes, a model-like figure, and an enchanting smile. She portrayed the typical high school cheerleader, but was also extremely intelligent. We had plans for her to take college courses while I focused on providing for us. My shifts were grueling, and within just a few months, I was physically and emotionally drained from the unending 24-hour work. After each shift, all I craved was a warm meal and sleep. As newlyweds, we did have intimacy, typically 3 times a week, but I was so fatigued that I would often fall asleep immediately after. Consequently, Erin's attention began to drift. She enrolled in some college classes, and it was common in that environment for officers to supplement their income by teaching night classes as adjunct professors. One such professor was an officer I will refer to as Captain Dustin. My wife frequently praised how intelligent he was and shared her admiration for his courses. After hearing about how wonderful this instructor was, I decided to attend one of her classes and peered in through the window to observe her facial expressions, which suggested she had a crush on him. When we finally met, I had to address him as Captain Dustin, while she simply called him Keith. Instantly, I felt unsettled about their relationship, teacher-student, and grew concerned about their interactions outside of class. Yet the 24-hour shifts persisted. Toward the conclusion of this assignment, my wife requested a legal separation. I suspected it was linked to Captain Dustin, but without the financial means or the time to investigate, thanks to those grueling shifts, I merely signed the separation paperwork, allowing her to return to the continental United States 6 months before my rotation. I later discovered that her request for separation coincided with Captain Dustin's return to the States. I completed that tour 6 months later, and to my surprise, my wife seemed ready to rekindle our marriage. I deeply cared for her and, having been raised by a divorced mother, fervently wished to avoid divorce. Maintaining that goal was essential to me. Thus, I welcomed her back. Part of her return was influenced by the fact that my mother-in-law pressured her to reconcile with me. We found ourselves at a new duty station with a standard 8-hour workday. I had achieved a few promotions, and by this point, we had enough disposable income to indulge in dining out and enjoying date nights. One day, I returned home early and heard the phone ring as I entered the house. Back then, before the widespread adoption of cell phones, we had a landline in the kitchen and another in the upstairs bedroom. My wife answered, saying, "Hello, Keith." I was on the kitchen extension and quickly covered the receiver so she wouldn't realize I was listening. My suspicions about her infidelity with Captain Dustin were confirmed when I overheard, "Can we talk?" and "I miss you," along with some revealing details about their year-long affair. Dustin had literally followed us to our new duty station. I didn't have a recorder with me. If I had, perhaps that evidence would have helped. Nevertheless, my wife concluded the call with, "I love you," before hanging up. I felt devastated. Without hesitation, I confronted her. "How long?" After much tearful discussion, she confessed to being intimate with him during her time as his student, the classic teacher-student fantasy, and rekindling their affair after my return to the USA. Why him? She presented numerous reasons. I was just a soldier earning a meager salary, while he was a captain receiving extra flight pay, putting me in the lower income bracket, and he had ample disposable income. As a result, she claimed he could take her to nice restaurants, book motels, and buy her gifts while I struggled to cover rent and utilities. She expressed her frustration with poverty. Like any man, I couldn't help but wonder if he was superior in bed, larger, or more thrilling. She assured me that his anatomy was not larger than mine, and although he was decent, he wasn't exceptional. When I asked why, she replied, "He makes me feel like a princess, whereas you are still a pauper." I immediately began to strategize on how to deal with him. However, this would need to be a carefully executed plan, because an assault on a superior officer by a junior soldier would likely lead to a court-martial and possible jail time. I could not merely stand by and let this 28-year-old creep continue to be intimate with my now 21-year-old wife. She constantly cried, "It was a mistake." I responded that it might have been a mistake during our time overseas due to my demanding schedule, but it was certainly not a mistake when we returned to the USA. He pursued her after our separation ended, and she willingly engaged with him. She retorted, "But I came back to you." I countered that she was still seeing him. This led to the end of our intimate life together. I had no desire for second-hand affection from her. Consequently, my disgust and lack of interest in my wife pushed her back into his arms. After several weeks of tension, animosity, and silence, she suggested, "We need to talk." I agreed. She claimed that she had never withheld food, affection, or love from me while still being involved with him. She maintained that our marriage was her priority, and he was merely a source of physical pleasure, a fleeting excitement that helped her feel cherished when I was unavailable. I acknowledged that my military obligations made me absent while deployed. Those 24-hour shifts were exhausting. However, we resumed our marriage when I returned to the United States and started working 8-hour shifts. How was I unavailable? I had accepted her back because I was still infatuated with my former cheerleader. She remained the attractive, athletic woman I had married. Still, I was growing increasingly agitated upon discovering she was being intimate with him, despite my present availability. Apart from short field training exercises, typically a week out of every 8, I returned home each evening. I later learned they were engaging during lunch hours and would spend every moment at a motel whenever I was deployed for training. I must admit, her allure could drive any man wild. I warned her that I would confront him if she continued to see him. Within a week, I received orders for a 1-year unaccompanied tour overseas, heading towards a combat zone, and she made love to me nightly until my departure. In short, I had no time to seek my revenge. While stationed overseas, my wife communicated with me through letters. I would respond in kind. At that time, email was not commonly used, especially in a combat zone, meaning each letter took a week to reach one another. Consequently, I sent and received 24 letters throughout the year. As soldiers rotated in and out of my unit, I heard various accounts of my wife socializing at the officers' and non-commissioned officers' club. No one provided concrete proof, but whispers of her being overly friendly drove me to madness. I heard rumors about her sleeping with Captain Keith D., Captain Jeff C., Captain Tom R., and eventually a man named Rick C. According to the gossip, she had transformed from a sweet young bride into someone completely different. I became intent on seeking revenge. I eagerly anticipated my mid-tour leave. After serving 6 months, I had 2 weeks at home before a return for another 6-month stint. However, when I went to purchase my airline ticket, I discovered that the money I had saved in a separate account had already been withdrawn a month prior. I attempted to use my credit card, but found it was maxed out. I had 2 weeks off but no means to return home. I managed to reach a phone and called home every 2 hours for the first day of my leave. No answer. I tried again the following day, again without response. Frustrated, I wrote an angry letter asking about my ticket money and what was happening with Keith, Jeff, and Tom. My savings and checking accounts were drained, and my credit card was maxed out, leading me to return to my unit and cancel my leave. I spent another 6 months on the front lines and volunteered for every perilous mission that arose. I gained the respect of my fellow soldiers and earned a promotion that year. Eventually, I returned home with several new medals, a sense of achievement, and an urgent desire for a divorce. I had not heard from my wife in several months, leading me to believe our marriage was over. When I arrived back in the USA, I discovered my wife was pregnant. I had been away for 12 months, and she was now 4 months along. She was uncertain about the father's identity, given that she had been with multiple partners. She suggested, "We can resolve this," but I was uninterested in remaining married to someone unfaithful. Some situations cannot be reconciled. In addition to being pregnant, my wife also had a sexually transmitted disease and pelvic inflammatory disease. I promptly filed for divorce, though unfortunately, our state did not recognize infidelity as grounds for divorce. It was a no-fault state. Eventually, we had a hearing, and while I was not obligated to pay alimony, I was burdened with child support payments, even though the child was not biologically mine. In our state, if married to the mother, you are deemed responsible for the child regardless of biological ties. Ultimately, I was divorced and experienced a newfound sense of freedom for the first time in 4 years. She completed her college education while we were married, and regrettably, I had co-signed her student loans, making me liable for that as well. I also found myself responsible for a lingering car payment and child support. I volunteered to return to the combat zone, as it offered danger pay and 3 meals a day at no cost. 16 years later, I received a letter from her daughter, and I was ecstatic. I was still serving in the Army, but this was the first communication from a child I had financially supported for the past 16 years. In the letter, she expressed a desire to change her last name and be adopted by her mother's new spouse. Lacking any biological connection to this child, I wrote back granting her request. The adoption effectively ended my child support obligations, and I finally felt as though I could move forward. Her mother had married one of her affair partners, Rick, and the child, who was not genetically mine, took his last name, was legally adopted, and years later, had Rick walk her down the aisle at her wedding. I did not receive an invitation to that event, so why am I sharing this story? I simply needed to release it from my mind. After 4 years of emotional turmoil and nearly 2 decades of feeling trapped, I am finally a free individual. I have often contemplated seeking out her various lovers for revenge, but following the divorce, I focused on becoming the best version of myself. I obtained both a bachelor's and master's degree and eventually found a devoted wife. My story has a happy conclusion. However, attaining that satisfaction took almost 2 decades. Why did I refrain from pursuing vengeance? In reality, no woman is worth incarceration. Furthermore, nothing less than extreme violence justified my revenge. I moved on from a treacherous partner, a liar, and a thief, and embarked on a successful military career, despite having superiors devoid of ethics and no hesitation in exploiting a junior soldier's spouse. In the end, my journey serves as a reminder that loyalty and integrity are invaluable. Although it took nearly 20 years, I found my happy ending and peace.